Wealth inequality in the US is getting out of control. The top 1% now owns over 30% of all the wealth in the country, while the bottom 42% owns less than 1%. This extreme disparity is not only morally repugnant, it's also dangerous for our society, and that's why we should talk about it more often. But the sad reality is that most Americans don't even know how bad the situation has gotten, let alone how it happened. So here are the 5 big reasons why so much wealth is concentrated in the hands of so few people in this country. Alright, so to start, let me just say that this video isn't about hating rich people or being jealous of their success. After all, becoming wealthy is often the result of hard work, innovation, and taking risks. But when a handful of people become so wealthy that they own more than everyone else combined, there's clearly something wrong with the system. So here are the 5 biggest problems. Number 1 is globalization and technological change. Technological change has always been a double-edged sword. It can either raise living standards dramatically or wipe out entire industries and ways of life. For example, from 1970 to 2004, the US produced 3 technological revolutions that transformed the way we live: computers, semiconductors, and the internet. These innovations created huge amounts of wealth, but also displaced millions of workers. Studies show that since the 1980s, we've seen an enormous shift towards high-skill, high-wage jobs and away from middle-skill, middle-wage jobs. And since the 1990s, we've seen more and more middle-skill jobs get replaced by high-skill ones. What this means is that globalization and technological change have hollowed out the middle class and pushed up the demand for highly skilled workers while leaving millions of other workers behind. In fact, according to the Congressional Budget Office, between 1979 and 2007, the average worker saw his or her wage grow by just 13% after accounting for inflation. That's barely any growth at all. On top of that, globalization has led to an increase in global supply and a decrease in prices for everyday goods. But the benefits of these lower prices haven't gone to lower and middle-income households. Instead, those households spend a smaller share of their income on everyday goods than higher-income households do. So while globalization has brought us cheaper goods, it hasn't helped the people who need it the most. The second factor driving wealth inequality is declining union membership. Union membership has fallen sharply from a high of 35% in the 1950s to just 6% today. This decline has left workers with less bargaining power and reduced their ability to push for higher wages. This is unsurprising when you consider that unions were outlawed in many parts of the country and union leaders have been systematically dismantled. In fact, union busting has become so common that one study found that if you're a private sector union member, there's only a 50-50 chance that you'll keep your job. As union membership has declined, the bargaining power of workers has declined along with it. Between 1973 and 2018, the average worker saw his or her wages grow by 16% after accounting for inflation. That's pretty anemic growth, especially when you consider that productivity, which measures how much output workers produce for each hour of work, grew by 70% over the same time period. In other words, workers aren't getting paid for their productivity. They're getting paid less and less every year. Number 3 is the rise of shareholder value. In the 1980s, something remarkable happened. CEOs stopped being paid based on the size of their company and instead started being paid based on how much the company's stock had increased in value. Well, this might sound like a great idea, but it turns out that it's led to some really bad behavior. For example, companies have been taking on record amounts of debt to buy back their own stock, which artificially inflates its price and boosts executive compensation. They've also been spending billions on advertising and marketing rather than investing in new products and innovation. And perhaps most concerningly, they've been laying off workers in order to boost profits and please investors. In fact, one study found that for every $1 of profit a company earned, it fired 24 workers. And it's no wonder why, when executives are incentivized to maximize shareholder value, they have little choice but to cut costs and boost profits. And guess what? Workers are costs. Number 4 is the demise of antitrust enforcement. Since the 1980s, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of companies that dominate entire industries. For example, in the airline industry, we've gone from 12 major airlines to just 4, and in banking, we've gone from dozens of major banks to just 4. This consolidation has given these companies enormous power to set prices, make record profits, and reward their shareholders handsomely. But it's also given them the power to crush small businesses, exploit workers, and hike up prices for consumers. This last point is especially important because it shows that these large companies are not just harming small businesses and workers, they're harming all of us. In fact, one study found that areas with more local concentration of a company's market power have experienced a 32% increase in consumer prices. And another found that if a company has a 10% increase in market power, prices will go up by 1.28%. So not only is the demise of antitrust enforcement leading to record profits and stock buybacks, it's also leading to higher prices for consumers. Finally, number 5 is the corruption of our political system. Money equals power, especially when it comes to our political system. Billionaires like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson can afford to lobby politicians, fund think tanks, and make campaign donations. They can also afford to hire armies of lawyers to write laws and regulations in their favor. This has given them the power to shape our political system to their benefit and the benefit of their shareholders. In fact, one study found that if a politician takes a donation from a major corporation, he or she is more likely to vote in favor of that corporation's interests. In other words, our politicians are for sale, and the evidence is clear. While campaign contributions from ordinary citizens have increased since the 1970s, they represent a much smaller share of overall donations. Meanwhile, donations from the richest Americans and corporations have skyrocketed. In fact, the richest 1% of Americans now account for 30% of all campaign donations. All right, so those are the 5 biggest reasons why wealth inequality has gotten so out of control in this country. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is horrible, but what can I do about it? Well, luckily for you, there are plenty of things you can do. First, you can educate yourself and others about wealth inequality. The more we understand the problem, the more we can do to fix it. Second, you can support organizations that are working to address wealth inequality. There are a lot of great organizations out there doing important work, and your support can help them do even more. Finally, you can vote and make your voice heard. We have the power to change our political system, but we have to use it. If you want a more equal and just world, you have to get involved. Don't sit back and let the billionaires and corporations rig the game in their favor. All right, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, wealth inequality is a problem we can solve, but we have to try. So let's get to work.